Hi, I'm Professor Ron Wixman, and I'm going to give a talk today on the context. That's an important thing, the context of the Armenian genocide. We've all heard about it, and of late it's been in the news. The one thing that's been missing is discussion of what actually happened. And I don't mean how many people were killed. That's another matter. There's estimates from 600,000 to 1.5 million. That's not the issue of this talk. What I'd like to talk to you about, and I've studied this region for 50 years, and I've even written articles on this particular topic, is that the genocide of Armenians needs to be seen in light of the geopolitics of the Ottoman Empire between Russian and English imperial interests. The point of this is that the Armenians were used as pawns by the Russians, who used their alliance with Armenians, and then during World War I, when the English, the French, the Italians, and the Russians invaded the Ottoman Empire, Armenians were caught in the middle, given the propaganda that had been used to get them into it. Let me give you just one example of how treaties came about. The Balfour Declaration is one of the most famous of all declarations dealing with the establishment of a Jewish state of Israel. Now, one might think this had something to do with the plight of Jews in Europe. It absolutely didn't. This treaty was written, and I'm going to talk about treaties in this talk. The Balfour Declaration was issued specifically because the British government believed that Jews controlled America. The United States was not wanting to get into World War I, and it was believed by the British that if they could convince Jews in America who controlled the United States that nonsense, the Jews controlled the world, that the Jews would force the US into the war. That had tremendous ramifications. So one of the treaties I'm going to talk about, and one that's critical, is one that most people have never heard of, and that's the Treaty of Sèvres, Sevres, a suburb of Paris. I'm going to separate this talk into three simple parts, because without that, I don't think you'll have a clear understanding. One is the geopolitics of the Ottoman Empire in lieu of British and Russian imperial interests. The second is the Treaty of Sèvres, with the desires of Armenians and Kurds for their own independent states to be supported by Britain, France, and Russia. And the third is on the impact later, which led to the invasion of Turkey by the Greeks in the 1920s, the ethnic cleansing of Muslims from Macedonia, Bulgaria, Serbia, etc., and worse, the deportation of nationalities out of the Caucasus when the Russian government in 1944 wanted to invade Turkey, and the Treaty of Sèvres and Armenians were once again used to promote Russian imperial interests. And I want to stress, with all of them came the lies. This is very common for governments to have rationalizations rather than actual intention. To give you a simple example, the Soviet Union was intending on invading Turkey at the end of World War II. However, Muslim people stood in their way within the Soviet Union. They had to be removed in the eyes of Stalin. And Armenians needed to be used to justify the Russian invasion. So, Crimean Tatars and North Caucasians en masse, 100%, every man, woman, and child was deported to Central Asia. Approximately half of them died. However, the Soviet Union was not about to say, hey, we're going to invade Turkey. Instead, they accused these peoples of colluding with the Nazis, which was not true at all. But that has to do, again, with the later impact of the Russian-Turkish geopolitical struggle. So let me begin. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the 19th century. Britain and France were absolutely obsessed with the expansion of Russia into Asia and southward. This was called the Great Game, and that's already well known. Russia seized Central Asia, almost bordering on the British Raj. They seized the North Caucasus. They seized the Crimea in the Crimean War. And you might ask, why are Britain and France fighting for the Ottoman Empire in the Crimean War? This has to do with the same thing: stop the Russians. And in the Balkans, the Russians counted on their Serbian, Bulgarian, and Greek allies to oust the Ottomans and implant Russian interests. Those are called, in a sense, the Russo-Turkish wars of the 19th century. They were one war on three fronts. There is no real Crimean War. They're the Russo-Turkish wars. But the Armenians play a tremendous role in this. And they were used, and I want to stress this, this is not to blame Armenians or anyone else. They were used. And the Armenians, being a Christian people with a large population in the Ottoman and Persian empires, were used by the Russians as fellow Christians to help them in their war, first against the Persian Empire. Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, which we see today as independent countries out of former Soviet republics, were seized as a result of wars in the early 19th century by Russia against Persia. There were many Armenians there. The Armenians, to a great extent, openly supported the Russians, and that's how Soviet Armenia, or later what became Soviet Armenia, came into existence. There were more Armenians in the capital of Georgia, Tbilisi, and in Baku in Azerbaijan than Georgians or Azerbaijanis. There was a massive influx of Armenians into the Russian Empire. Now, Ottoman Turkey was not at all oblivious of this. When Russia now turned its interest on Ottoman Turkey and wanted to seize Constantinople, which is very important. I'm not going to get into why. That's irrelevant for this. But the Russians saw the Black Sea as a potential Russian sea, with their Eastern Orthodox allies of Greeks, Romanians, and Bulgarians on the west, and Georgian and Armenians in the east, and using the large Greek settlements of northern Turkey, they hoped to annex this area. I'd like to show you on this map exactly what I've been talking about. If we look at the borders of the Ottoman Empire at its peak, notice that by the very beginning of the 19th century, this area from Persia had been taken by the Russians. This area, populated by the Crimean Tatars and parts of Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, had been liberated by the Russians, and that's important. Here, the British took Egypt. By 1912, the Italians had taken Libya, and the French had taken Algeria and Tunisia. In other words, what we saw by the beginning of the 20th century is that the Ottoman state was shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And it was shrinking to a great extent because nationalism, and this is an important point, nationalism was actually absent in much of the world until the beginning of the 19th and well into the 20th centuries. We even see Italian states and German states being connected into individual United States only in the middle of the 19th century. The idea was, where my people live, we should have a country. So for Greeks living on the coast of Turkey should be part of Greece. For Armenians, where Armenians live should be an Armenian state. For Kurds, let there be a Kurdish state. There was already a whole series of states in Europe that had come about. Armenians and Greeks were both thoroughly influenced by these movements of nationalism. The Turks reacted to it by creating a Turkish national movement. Remember, the Ottoman Empire was not Turkish in population. The Ottoman Empire was overwhelmingly non-Turkish, but it was ruled by Turks. In the same way, if we looked at the Russian Empire in 1917, only 40% of the entire Russian Empire was Russian-speaking Russian. 60% were non-Russians. And to show you how this idea of nationalism was working in Russia, which at that time was becoming one of the largest countries in the world and challenging even the British and the French for colonial interest, Tsar Nicholas I declared that only ethnic Russians, people of the Russian Orthodox faith, and those who could speak Russian could be citizens of the Russian Empire, leaving out all the Baltic peoples, the Armenians, the Azerbaijanis, the Central Asian, and of course, as we all know, Jews were not citizens either. So if we're going to understand this horrible thing that happened to the Armenians, and shortly after the debacle of the Greek invasion of Turkey, we have to understand that nationalism was one of the leading things that led to this horrible situation. And one can easily say, this is what caused World War I. Now let's turn to World War I. World War I led to a series of changes and alliances that eventually led to the horrible Armenian genocide that we all know about. That I'm explaining why it came about and the role that Armenian nationalists played or others in no way is meant to excuse the actual slaughter of the Armenians. But it does need to be explained because the current view is innocent Armenians are sitting there and all of a sudden horrible Turkish Muslims come and kill them. That is a narrative that is lacking in anything factual. Now let's look at the actual situation of World War I. The British and the French, as I mentioned before, were attempting to help dismantle the Ottoman Empire and decided that should the Ottomans lose, and being the sick man of Europe, they were guaranteed to lose. The Russians, for their part, wanted to liberate Constantinople. Remember, that was the center of their belief system. The Orthodox Church came from there. And let's look at the Russian name and the Bulgarian name and Serbian name for Constantinople. We in the West named it for Constantine. The Russian word is Tsarigrad, the city of Caesar. And the Russians saw themselves as the third Rome because the last legitimate empress of the Byzantine state after Constantinople fell fled to Moscow, which was an Orthodox city, and married the Russian prince, the Prince of Moscow. Their son, therefore, became what? Tsar. The first Caesar of Russia is Ivan IV, who then went about starting a system where Russia declared itself the future liberator and the Reconquista, the reconquest of Constantinople. This played a tremendous role in the Russian mind. Russians saw themselves as the protectors of all of Eastern Orthodoxy. The British and the French were hell-bent on stopping Russian expansion. That was why they got into the Crimean War, which had nothing to do with anything. Therefore, a treaty was signed in secret in 1915. Remember, the war started in 1914. In 1915, at the suburb of Paris, Sèvres, the Russians, the French, and the British sat down and drew a new map. And I would like to show that map to you because it explains what's going to happen. This map clearly shows the problem and why the Armenians were destroyed as a people in the Ottoman state. Here is the boundary of modern Turkey, approximate. Now, this area here and this area of Western Turkey was to go to Greece, including the city of Izmir, or in Greek Smyrna. This area with Constantinople, Bursa, and a number of other important cities and access to the Mediterranean from the Black Sea was to be called international, meaning under Russian dominance. The Italians were going to get this part of Turkey, the French, all of southeast Turkey, including what is today Lebanon and Syria. But now let's look to the east. This area was claimed by Russia. They invaded the Ottoman state from here, and they, along with Armenian nationalists, and I want to stress this, there were many nationalist Armenians who promoted Russian aggression against Turkey. And notice this tiny little area was to become a Kurdistan, and I will show you what the Kurds claimed shortly. So, what happened in 1915? This is signed, but then what also happens? The British and their allies, the Australians and the New Zealanders, the Anzac troops, were soundly defeated here at the Dardanelles, thereby neutralizing the British and French interest. Russia had to withdraw its troops because they were fighting the Germans and Austrians on their Western Front. That left this Armenian territory without protection, and Enver Pasha, the general who defeated the British, now turned his forces against Armenians, basically saying, as long as there are Armenians in our territory, we can never be free of the Russians. So there was anger because, yes, and we need recognize this, most Armenians were obviously innocent common people. But isn't this true in all wars? The innocent are the ones who pay the price of the nationalists. So, as there were nationalist uprisings among the Armenians, led by radical Armenian nationalists, the Ottomans, or the Turks at that time, said, we have got to get rid of the Armenian problem. Now I want to show you two maps that will also show you what happened to the Armenians. We have to understand that, as I showed, this area here is what was agreed upon by the Russians, the English, and the French. This was already the Russian province of Armenia, part of the Russian Empire. So the Russian view was they would then extend their territory with British and French agreement. Now, let's look at what the Armenians were actually claiming. This is completely lost in modern discussions. Look at this line here. This is the boundary of what Armenian nationalists claim should be a legitimate Armenia. Let me repeat that. This was Russian-controlled Armenia. This is what Russia, England, and France agreed would be an extended Armenia, but Armenians themselves were claiming all of this, more than 1/3 the territory of Turkey. So this is why the Turks became paranoid about Armenian nationalism. And as I said, in their view, Armenians had to go. Now I'm going to show you a map of the Kurdish claims, because this plays a phenomenal role as well. Let's look at the boundaries of what the Kurds called a Greater Kurdistan. This. Notice, this is exactly part of the territory claimed by the Armenians. Of course, Kurds also claim part of Syria, part of Iraq, and part of Iran to have a Kurdish state, which we still hear about today. So what do we end up with? Armenians claiming this, Kurds claiming this. Now, whom did the Kurds see as supporting Armenians? The huge Russian military state, Britain and France, fearing that Russia and those countries would actually make an Armenia that took away most of their territory. As Armenians were fleeing south, there was the total massacre of the Armenians here. But as Armenian refugees were trying to get to Syria, Kurdish nationalists continue to kill Armenians. So we have this with the Turkish army, and then we have here Kurdish militants massacring Armenian refugees as they were fleeing. At the end of World War I, we actually saw the total demise and the genocide of the Armenians within the former Ottoman state. But we tend to stop there and forget that this map is going to be the cause of the next major series of wars in Turkey. The Greeks, who in their eyes were to take these islands from Turkey and this whole area and liberate the two large Greek cities of Constantinople or Istanbul and Izmir or Smyrna, Greece invaded Turkey believing that they were now going to get the help of the English, the French, and the Russians, because in their eyes, this map was still legitimate. So Greece invaded Turkey in the early 1920s, and at first they were winning, but they got no help from the English and the French or the Russians. And then Kemal Atatürk, who's called the father of modern Turkey, turned the Turkish army and drove out the Greeks. Today, we have a narrative that those horrible Turks massacred those innocent Greeks. Once again, we're overlooking that although we're Christian and we tend to side with the Christian minorities, it wasn't Christianity and Islam, it was Turkish nationalism versus Armenian nationalism and Greek nationalism. At the end of this war, with the Greeks defeated, they ethnically cleansed northern Macedonia and the northern part of southern Macedonia and the part of Thrace, Bulgaria, that reached the Aegean Sea. They completely decimated the Bulgarian and Macedonian populations, and then replaced them with Greeks coming from this area and from Alexandria, Egypt. So as a result of this map, this treaty, Greeks went to war against Turkey, and then this ended with hundreds of thousands of Muslim Serbs, Bosnians, Bulgarians, Greeks, and Albanians fleeing to Turkey as Christian Greeks went to northern Greece. So what we end up seeing with this is the Treaty of Sèvres, and we talk about Armenian genocide. We've completely ignored the expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Muslims from the Balkans in this population exchange. I'd like to touch on a last topic, and one that's near and dear to my heart, particularly because I'm one of the first people to have written on this subject. In fact, one of the subjects of my PhD was a book on the North Caucasus. And this deals with Imperial Russian and Soviet treatment of the Caucasus. At the end of World War II, there was a narrative, a total false narrative, that the Crimean Tatars, Karachay-Balkars of the North Caucasus, and the Chechen Ingush were deported to Central Asia with half the populations being killed. Notice that we talk about Greeks being killed and we talk about Armenians being killed, yet we don't talk about it because this false accusation, and I'm stressing this, of course there were some Crimean Tatars and others that how shall I say, sided with the Nazis. But that can't compare with the number of Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, and Russians who had sided with the Nazis, given how horrible Stalin was. The actual reason, not excuse, for their deportation was that the Stalin, being victorious in the war, not only pushed the border westward against Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and part of Finland that were incorporated directly into the Soviet Union, plus moving the borders of Poland and changing that border, Stalin clearly intended to invade Turkey. And the reason that this is clear is by looking where those people were located. The Crimea as a peninsula is where the Russian Navy was based. They would have needed to use that base. They'd have to go along the coast of the Black Sea, where you have the Western Adige, or Circassians. They were deported. Only the ones along the road. The pass through the Caucasus, there's only one. And that goes through the area between the Karachay-Balkars and the Chechen-Ingush people. All of those people in the 19th century openly fought for the Turks, openly was supportive of the Ottoman Empire, and there was massive destruction of their populations. Stalin feared that if there was an invasion of Turkey that would go through the Crimea, along the Black Sea, and across the Caucasus, these peoples might be a problem. Stalin could not say, oh, by the way, I'm intending to invade Turkey. So he made up this cock and bull story that these people deserved to be deported. Every man, woman, and child. This was not just men. This was every single individual, to the point that in the great Soviet encyclopedia, the names of these peoples were expunged. They no longer had an entry on either the people or their territories. But there's one last thing that really tells it all, and that is on the border of Armenia, Georgia, and the Soviet Union is a small area in which there were Muslim Armenians called Khemshin, Shahsevans, who were people who supported Iran, the Shah, lovers of the Shah, Kurds, and Muslim Georgians. These people were nowhere charged with anything. Couldn't charge them with supporting the Nazis because Nazis never got that far. I wrote an article called The Meskhetian Turks, A New Voice in Central Asia. And that showed clearly that these people were deported because they were openly pro-Turkish, and Stalin feared that in an invasion of Turkey, they would also side with them. So what about the Armenians? Isn't it interesting that at that time, when Stalin decided to deport those people, the Catholicos of Echmiadzin, the head of the Armenian Christian church in the Soviet Union, declared that Russia was obligated to go back to the Treaty of Sèvres and create a free and independent Armenia under Russia's rule, and that area should be annexed to Armenia. Armenian nationalists, once again, were trying to create an Armenian state. Unfortunately, for those other peoples mentioned, Stalin never invaded. But he certainly couldn't turn around and now say, oh, by the way, I changed my mind. Or, by the way, we're going to deport peoples because we're preparing to invade Turkey. Now, maybe you also understand that after 2 centuries of Russian, Turkish, and Soviet Turkish negative relations based on Russian territorial expansion against Turkey, we can understand better why the Turks were pro-European and the Turks were incorporated into NATO. Why would Turkey care about NATO? It's because Russia still has these views of someday taking Istanbul and Armenia. Thank you for listening. All of what I said to this point was to point out what actually happened, the treaties between the great powers and what that did, how Armenians were used, etc. No way can we excuse the Turkish army and the Turkish government for what it did to the Armenians, nor the Kurdish nationalists that slaughtered them on the way. That is a great catastrophe, however one wishes to define it. But what I want to get to is that we have somehow or other forgotten that it's the great power politics, the colonialism, that has caused so much of the misery in the world. In particular, when we look at what happened around World War I with this nightmare in the Ottoman Empire, we had Britain and France colluding as great power states, two rivals around the world colluding with each other, with the Russian Empire, which they were trying to stop shortly before from expanding. We somehow or other don't look at the real impact of treaties. The Treaty of Sèvres was a nightmare, and it was simply a treaty of convenience between competing empires. And once again, it is the common people in those countries that absolutely suffered. And let me remind you of one thing that I said earlier. The Balfour Declaration was part of this. The United States was not willing to get into Britain's war against Germany. Therefore, the British signed a document that had no meaning at all at the time and certainly wasn't legal, saying that Israel would be given, which by the way wasn't Ottoman territory, that Israel would be given to Jews, even though they didn't have a protectorate at the time, and that the Jews controlled America. Therefore, Britain could trick the Jews of America into forcing America into a war. All of that is the same thing. It is all part of a period of imperial history. And to end this, Armenians and Greeks paid the price of the great power politics.